So what happens now?
You know what happens now. You're quickly becoming a legend.
2 years ago, Warner Brothers and Guy Ritchie released the culmination of 13 years of planning. After 2004's tepid King Arthur, directed by Antoine Fuqua, a film that tried to copy Gladiator to a fault, many productions were considered, including an Excalibur remake by Bryan Singer, no thank you, and a King Arthur plus Lancelot feature. But Warner Brothers finally settled on a plan for the modern era. A cinematic universe using the Arthurian legend that borrowed from the tone and style of their successful Dark Knight trilogy, and it was to be made by popular British filmmaker Guy Ritchie, starring Charlie Hunnam, Jude Law, Djimon Hounsou, Eric Bana, and David Beckham. It would cost $175 million plus an extra $100 million in marketing and set up 7 movies. And it failed. King Arthur was a financial failure, failing to open #1 at the box office in America or China in May, losing to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Alien Covenant, Pirates of the Caribbean Dead Man Tell No Tales, Dangal, and Warner Brothers' own Wonder Woman. Against its total $275 million cost, that might have been actually larger, it only ended up making $150 million and lost Warner Brothers about that much. The same year, Justice League, Geostorm, the Lego Ninjago movie, Blade Runner 2049, Chips failed to draw in the necessary profits, while Wonder Woman, It, Annabelle Creation, Dunkirk, Kong Skull Island, the Lego Batman movie did very well for them. It also got fairly well mauled by critics who complained about the story, direction, and intent at a bigger universe. And to be honest, I think attempting a cinematic universe with a rather basic Arthurian legend was bad and something Warner Brothers must have realized as production was going on. The film shot in 2015, but was pushed back from its 2016 release a few times to the eventual 2017 May release. And considering the editing, lack of enthusiasm for sequels, it feels like Warner Brothers really did regret committing to this film as a franchise starter, considering it was a Frankenstein's monster-style screenplay where they borrowed every King Arthur idea lying around, and just wanted to make a viewable product for audiences, much the same way they handled Justice League that same year. So, it's 2019 now. Guy Ritchie's newest film is the remake of Disney's Aladdin. No one really talks about this movie, so why am I talking about it? Well, for whatever reason, the film has been stuck in my head along with the positive review by Lucy Jane Patterson. You could check out the link in the description below to her Twitter and popcornandpnm.weebly.com. Plus, this trailer is pretty fun to rewatch. So, what's my thoughts on the film? Well, first, I want to talk about my relationship to Guy Ritchie and the Arthurian legend as cinema. I discovered Guy Ritchie through his continued style referencing in online media, particularly in film reviews and Film Riot's Guy Ritchie text video, and didn't fully watch one of his films until I acquired Sherlock Holmes: A Game of Shadows on Blu-ray. I gradually discovered more and more of his work, only not seeing rock and roll yet, and in terms of rankings, Lock and Two Smoking Barrels, pretty good, hasn't fully grown on me. Snatch, really enjoy. Swept Away, trash. Revolver, really enjoyed despite the negative press. Sherlock Holmes, kind of weak. Sherlock Holmes: A Game of Shadows, pretty good. The Man from U.N.C.L.E., mixed. So I was curious of his attempt at a King Arthur, and especially his Aladdin film. His trademark is his visuals, cockney comedic attitudes, and a mixture of editing to playful storytelling. He's worked with many great actors, including Jason Statham, Benicio del Toro, Brad Pitt, Tom Hardy, Idris Elba, and Robert Downey Jr., and even his lesser films have something interesting to them. Except Swept Away. That's his worst film. And as a director, he needs a good script. He's often written his own, but a bad script can botch up the project. He needs to be in tune with the vision, goal, style, and story of the film to be on point. Sometimes studios cut him down, like Man from U.N.C.L.E., and sometimes it's his own fault. But I think one day he'll make a film to equal the success and critical darling of Snatch. But for reference, Revolver is my favorite film of his. Now, in terms of Arthurian legend on screen, Excalibur is my favorite film in that canon thanks to Boorman's darker take on the material. Plus, it looks great. I like Disney's Sword in the Stone. Quest for Camelot is a fun nostalgia piece. I liked Monty Python's and the Holy Grail, and I want to see The Kid Who Would Be King. That's about it, really. Arthurian legend is more interesting when it's used as a reference point or stuff like Excalibur is just around, like Soul Eater. And I'd have to say the best lasting Arthurian take in cinema is Star Wars, as Luke is clearly an Arthur analog, Obi-Wan as Merlin, Darth Vader the evil wizard, and such. The Last Jedi, using the tragic, dark parts of Arthurian legend, was great. Overall, though, Arthurian legends really are something to take inspiration from, as direct adaptation attempts rarely work. Personally, I'm writing my own deconstructionist take on King Arthur, and the story is intended to remove the halo that Arthur has as a character and legend in the goal of asking people to re-evaluate their heroes. King Arthur has a lot that storytellers, filmmakers, and artists can use in creativity. The right approach is always the key. So, that brings us to my opinion on the film itself. It's fine. Nowhere near as bad as the critics claimed. It's easily better than the likes of The Mummy, Robin Hood, Pirates of the Caribbean 5, and the Beauty and the Beast remake. But in terms of 2017 epic genre reworkings, I do prefer The Great Wall, Kong Skull Island, Thor Ragnarok, and even Transformers The Last Knight. The film for me is 50% good and 50% not quite as good. It's similar to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 in that it feels like each part of the film has a good side and a bad side. The acting is a mix, really good performance, and sometimes unconvincing lines and reactions. The visuals are a mix between genuinely inspired and sometimes rather muddy and uninteresting. The cinematography is sometimes outstanding, and sometimes lazy, ill-fitting, or just not helping. Sometimes the music is spot on, sometimes it's tonally inappropriate or annoying. Sometimes the editing and montages work like a charm, and sometimes they're downright confusing. The action goes between amazing epic scale fights that inspire, and sometimes they're just kind of bland. And the film doesn't always balance its epic fun fantasy film with dark realism. About the best thing this movie has going for it is its production values, sets, and visual effects. But first, we need to discuss the story from script to adaptation to the behind-the-studio cinematic universe plans. Story and tone-wise, the film starts like Snow White and the Huntsman, goes into 2010's Robin Hood by the way of Snatch, then feels like an Assassin's Creed / Aladdin film, then becomes a little bit like The Dark Knight / Man of Steel, and finally ends like Conan the Barbarian or Beowulf. It bounces between fun fantasy, epic dark fantasy, comedic crime story, fun superhero film, and dark superhero film. And it almost nails this, but not quite. The story and script is credited to Guy Ritchie, David Dobkin, Jobby Harold, and Lionel Wigram, and feels like the semi-awkward slicing that might come from them taking a bunch of ideas and trying to make an origin story for a cinematic universe, and then having to cut down your probably 3/2.5 hour movie into a solo installation with your world building and Merlin builder removed. A lot. Yeah, this is a King Arthur movie where Merlin is this behind-the-scenes player, and they promised to show and tell him in the next film, which will never happen. See, a big problem is that starting a production with the intent of setting up a universe and only at the editing hurdle decided to cross off the idea leads to an odd film. Because we've got all this exposition and setup and characters to build, but the editing appears to have neutered much of the film from a big sprawl 3-hour epic into a complacent 2-hour film with off editing. Now, anytime Ritchie pulls his classic tell a story, play with the time montage, it often works, and it's a lot of fun. Unfortunately, it keeps happening for random and unnecessary spots because the film feels like the studio kept wanting to rush to the next big scene. But the creative team told them they needed more clear setup to make sense, so they'll just play a scene sometimes and explain it during or after the fact. And that montage trick doesn't always work. There's one montage that feels like it was supposed to be a fairly lengthy scene of monster fighting tension, and it felt really truncated because it did not work as a montage. Then there's Ritchie's directing choices. Ritchie clearly has a lot to say on executing this film, but there's this very big tone problem wherein the film wants to have the darkness, weight, and gravity of a Game of Thrones universe. But Ritchie is still tied to his cheeky, semi-juvenile crime chops, while also making a pure fun-style fantasy film. It doesn't fully work and shows how the studio didn't exactly know what they wanted either, except really hoping this would be another constant franchise for them. There are some very dark moments, hence why this isn't a typically rated blockbuster, and it's hoping for mature audiences by Australian film ratings, but the film seems to consistently want to be a regular fun blockbuster. It feels like the creatives involved kept bouncing between a hardcore mature blockbuster and a more typical one, and couldn't pick. It'd be like if Thor Ragnarok wanted to try and be like 2019's Hellboy for a few moments. Then again, maybe Ritchie wanted to test out some new filmmaking techniques, especially CGI shots and GoPro Snorri cam for action scenes, along with more interesting visuals. Now, it's not the headache some people claim, but it doesn't add much aside from trying to make a gritty and realistic experience where one action scene is executed more like Black Hawk Down than a fantasy/medieval film. Warner Brothers was clearly and constantly trying to recapture The Dark Knight with this film. They've been doing it ever since that film's success became their biggest calling card, to the point other franchises like James Bond have been trying to copy it too. But here, it doesn't work. See, The Dark Knight is a fairly deconstructionist reworking of Batman, while still being a fairly fun Batman film. Legend of the Sword doesn't fit that, as King Arthur is never treated the same as Christopher Nolan's Batman, and instead they just went with the overall darker vibe, desaturated look, and superhero style arc. Hell, there's even a scene that's very reminiscent of one from Man of Steel, and it comes off as Warner Brothers begging audiences to please repeat The Dark Knight's success. For the record, John Mathiassen's cinematography feels its strongest when helped by the CGI team or Ritchie's desire for Michael Bay-esque experimentation with different cameras, but lackluster when there's none of that. It's very similar to his filmmaking career. Good: Gladiator, Hannibal, Kingdom of Heaven, X-Men First Class, Logan. Bad: Phantom of the Opera, Robin Hood, 47 Ronin, Pan. The music sometimes has a really nice kick for the action and montages, with composer Daniel Pemberton clearly having a difficult task. Daniel has done some great compositions, including Steve Jobs, All the Money in the World, and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. However, his only other collaboration with Ritchie was on The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and they don't feel fully synchronized. The score, sound design in general, feels like it goes between epic dark fantasy to comedic British crime feature. Imagine if the score bounced between sound like Game of Thrones and, well, a Guy Ritchie film from 2000. It doesn't quite mesh and sometimes feels tonally at odds with the intent, especially one edit early on that almost feels comical. Plus, there's a particular sound design choice to sometimes focus on the breathing quite a bit that feels like it had a purpose, but plays more like someone needed to fill the often lacking sound space. As for the action, sometimes it's really cool, especially the few moments Excalibur is busted out, but other times it feels like an afterthought, and without much imagination, it's not until the third act kicks that it starts to full weave into the perfect mix of action, story, and visuals. As for the acting, Charlie Hunnam does a great job as King Arthur, in my opinion, as the low-raised, born-to-be king with a dark origin. I do think the arc of this character ultimately works, but is very little in terms of its narrative function and information. Most of the supporting cast does okay. Jude Law occasionally feels like he wants to go Jeremy Irons from Dungeons & Dragons levels of cheese, but was asked to play it seriously. Some of Arthur's friends from early on in the film are fun and play their parts well, but the allies he makes in the second act don't always work, and there's a particular scene where Djimon Hounsou's delivery is really off, and Astrid Berge's Frisbee's Guinevere as Merlin's mage understudy instead of King Arthur's love interest feels like she's way too serious, especially when Arthur's around. I'm not saying she needed to be a damsel in distress, but seeing as she's the largest female role in the film, it's a little disappointing the film just makes her a stone-faced expository deus ex machina vehicle to channel what Merlin would have been. Other minor stuff is the title credits are weirdly small and thin for my taste. The prostitutes who raised King Arthur should have had more part than motivational bodies. The first act is way too much in a hurry to get to the second act and lags just as it gets there. And some of the best shots from the trailer are in the film for maybe a few frames. But I did often have fun with the film. The opening with giant kaiju elephants was great. King Arthur's cheeky antics in the first act and late second act with his chums are the stuff the film should have been built around. And it's intentionally funny. It is. Some of the visual ideas are really fun. The effects are great. Excalibur is a really fun weapon. And Charlie Hunnam does a good job with the role. Overall, the film fully comes together in the final act when King Arthur begins to question what he's doing, and the Lady of the Lake has to bring him back to the hero's journey. With the final third act is a big sword battle, a giant snake ripping people apart, and King Arthur fighting a Dark Souls boss. It's fun, and I wish more of the film had been that way. It's just a shame it wasn't. In the end, it's not a poorly made, insane production nightmare like The Snowman or Justice League, not incompetent like 2017's The Mummy or M. Night's The Last Airbender, and more or less feels like Warner Brothers wanting a King Arthur film to be both The Dark Knight and Aquaman. Don't get me wrong, guys, I love some films that are absolutely hated by critics. Batman v Superman, Suicide Squad, the Jurassic World films, The Predator, Blair Witch, Hellboy and Serenity from this year, Venom, Sucker Punch, and Michael Bay's Transformers. So when I say King Arthur is a bit of a mess, but a rather fun mess that unpacking is kind of fun as well, I mean it. Granted, I did just write a giant editorial about why this film is only just fine, but if there's this much for me to discuss and still mostly enjoy the film, there's definitely a lot to look out. I recommend seeking it out cheap, or if it's on a streaming service and you want a bit of dumb fun that you might want to discuss later.
This young man, he died fair soon, by the light of the hunter's moon. Not by bow, yet by blade.
So what happens now?
You know what happens now. You're quickly becoming a legend. You and I